When investigators working a disappearance case say they have DNA, the public tends to imagine something abundant: a blood smear, a fingerprint-laden surface, a biological trove left behind by whoever was responsible. The reality in this case is considerably more precarious. What authorities reportedly have in their possession, the result of weeks of forensic processing and evidence review, is a single strand of hair recovered from the bedroom of a woman who has now been missing for more than 80 days. There is no root attached. That absence, the missing biological anchor at the base of the hair, would have rendered this evidence essentially worthless under the analytical standards that dominated forensic science for most of the past 4 decades. Under those older standards, a hair without a root could tell investigators something about maternal ancestry, but nothing precise enough to identify an individual. That limitation has since been overturned, but how this particular hair has been handled since its recovery raises questions that are difficult to answer charitably. The science of extracting usable DNA from rootless hair operates on a principle that the broader scientific community once dismissed as impossible. The key is not mitochondrial DNA, which runs through the shaft of a hair and traces only maternal ancestry, but a different class of genetic marker called single nucleotide polymorphisms. These are small but highly specific variations in the genetic sequence scattered throughout the genome that, when analyzed collectively, produce a profile unique enough to support genetic genealogy, the practice of building a family tree from a DNA profile and using it to identify an unknown contributor by working through relatives. A mitochondrial profile narrows things down to a lineage. A SNP profile narrows things down to a person. The difference, in investigative terms, is the difference between knowing someone probably had a grandmother from a particular region of the country and knowing their full name and home address. One forensic laboratory proved that this level of precision could be extracted from a rootless hair, not in theory, but in actual casework, including a case that ended with a serial murderer's conviction based in part on exactly this type of evidence. That same laboratory is now believed to be in possession of the hair from this bedroom. And that is both the most promising development in this investigation in months and the element around which the most serious concern is clustered. The concern is not about the lab's capability. Its track record speaks clearly. The concern is about how much of the hair remains available for analysis. Before it reached the specialists who are most qualified to work with it, the evidence reportedly passed through a different laboratory, one without a publicly documented record of success in SNP extraction from rootless hair. What testing that lab performed, how many analytical attempts were made, and how much of the biological material was consumed in the process are not known publicly. But the fundamental reality of SNP extraction from rootless hair is that the process destroys the sample. You cannot run the analysis, find that it did not work, and then run the same analysis again on the same material unchanged. Each attempt takes something from the hair that cannot be returned. The question of how much is left is not a minor technical footnote. It is the central variable on which the next phase of this investigation depends. What is also worth noting is how the hair was likely discovered in the first place. Evidence collection at a scene like a bedroom, enclosed, full of fabric surfaces, carpeted, layered with the biological residue of daily life, requires tools calibrated for trace evidence recovery. Standard swabbing works within the area the investigator chooses to swab. A more advanced collection system works across entire surfaces, using a fine liquid mist followed by suction through a filter medium, trapping biological material, hair, skin cells, fiber, that would escape a manual swab. These filter-based collection systems have demonstrably outperformed swabbing in recovering trace DNA from porous materials like bedding and upholstery. A hair caught in such a filter, if it remained intact through the collection process, represents exactly the kind of evidence this technique was designed to find. That it apparently took weeks or months to be identified within the collected material is consistent with the scale of a serious evidence sweep. Dozens or hundreds of items processed sequentially, with a single hair emerging from a filter that may have been sitting in a queue. For the family of the missing woman, the forensic situation they now face is one of enforced patience in a context that makes patience feel almost impossible. They are waiting for a laboratory result that may come back definitive, that may come back inconclusive, or that may not come back at all if the sample proves insufficient. They are doing this while simultaneously managing the fallout from an investigation that has lurched from apparent breakthrough to silence more times than anyone should have to endure. Tips that seemed credible led nowhere. Individuals detained for questioning were released without the public being told why. The official face of the investigation has offered almost no explanation for any of these outcomes, responding to direct questions from reporters with single-word denials. The family has watched this unfold in real time, and the psychological toll of watching a system meant to find their loved one behave this erratically is something that clinical professionals describe in terms of cumulative trauma, the kind that builds not from one devastating blow, but from a continuous series of small ones. Forensic genealogy as a discipline has had its most visible moments in cases where cold trails led to warm identifications, where hairs or cellular material gathered years or decades before were finally matched to living individuals through the genealogical database approach. But the discipline is equally applicable to active cases, and when it is applied to an active case, one where the missing person may still be alive, where every day carries the weight of what might be avoidable loss, the urgency attached to that laboratory analysis is of an entirely different order. Investigators who have worked in both cold and active contexts describe the pressure on lab personnel as immense. The knowledge that a result could mean a rescue attempt, could mean a living person comes home, changes the emotional register of the analysis entirely. Experienced forensic genealogists who have worked with this lab note that its staff is aware of this pressure and that active, hot cases are typically prioritized in their workflow. Whether that prioritization translates into a faster result is not guaranteed. The chemistry does not care about deadlines, but the intent and effort are there. The broader investigative picture remains clouded by the leadership situation at the county sheriff's office. An elected sheriff, the primary public face of this missing persons investigation, is now at the center of perjury allegations, rooted in statements he apparently made during a legal deposition. The core of the allegation is that he denied, under oath, having been suspended for disciplinary reasons during his law enforcement career, a claim that records from a previous department appear to directly contradict. Those records reportedly indicate multiple separate suspensions, each costing him days of unpaid leave, spread across a period of years at a law enforcement agency in another state. His legal team has framed this as a misunderstanding of the question, suggesting he interpreted it differently than it was intended. Legal observers note that whether a deposition is considered formally sworn testimony and whether the standard for perjury is met are both questions that require more than a soundbite to resolve. What is not in dispute is that the distraction this has created within the sheriff's office has been substantial and documented. The documented evidence of internal fracture, a union vote of no confidence, a department whose public communications have become essentially monosyllabic, creates a visible problem for the investigation, even if the sheriff himself remains in place. An agency whose internal relationships are under this kind of strain tends to show it in operational outputs. Slower internal communication, reduced willingness among field investigators to escalate uncomfortable findings to leadership, a defensive posture that prioritizes institutional protection over investigative transparency. The federal involvement in this case, which appears to have included both direct investigative participation and forensic coordination, represents a structural check against this kind of institutional deterioration. Federal investigators operate within a different chain of command and are not subject to the political pressures that shape county-level law enforcement. Their presence does not guarantee a successful outcome, but it does mean that the investigation has a backstop independent of the county structure. Correspondence claiming the missing woman was transported across the international border into the Mexican state of Sonora has introduced a geographic dimension to the case that experienced security professionals treat with a mixture of serious consideration and operational skepticism. Sonora is not a small or easily searchable place. It is a large state, much of it given over to desert terrain that challenges even well-resourced search operations. The infrastructure for coordinating a formal search of remote desert land in a foreign jurisdiction requires bilateral government-level cooperation, local law enforcement participation, and community willingness to engage, all of which are complicated significantly by the organized criminal presence that exerts effective control over large portions of Sonoran territory. People who work missing persons recovery in Mexico describe the environment there not as merely difficult, but as categorically different from anything a domestic search operation would encounter. The authorities themselves are often compromised, the communities are often coerced into silence, and the land itself is often held by networks that actively obstruct outside investigation. Drone-based aerial surveillance, which has become a practical tool in domestic missing persons searches, runs into specific complications in this context. The question of whether any given aerial survey can be conducted over privately held or cartel-controlled land is not answered by authorization from the relevant governments alone. It is answered, practically, by whether the people on the ground tolerate the presence of aircraft above their operations. There is documented history of drone interference in areas where organized crime networks operate. Beyond the operational challenges, there is the evidentiary challenge. Even if the note is taken at face value, it describes a sighting at an unspecified location within an enormous state, and it includes the claim that the missing woman is already deceased. That last detail is something investigators must weigh carefully, not because it makes the search less necessary, but because it changes the nature of what investigators would be searching for and what a successful outcome looks like. The forensic genealogy experts who have discussed this case publicly have been careful to note that the DNA hair evidence and the Mexico correspondence represent two entirely separate investigative threads, and that the progress of one does not depend on or predict the progress of the other. A successful SNP extraction from the bedroom hair would give investigators a genetic identity, a person to locate, investigate, and confront. It would not automatically explain where the missing woman is, whether she is alive, or how far the physical investigation needs to travel to find her. What it does is give investigators something they currently do not have: a name attached to trace biological evidence found inside her home. That is not a resolution. It is a starting point. From that starting point, investigators can begin to reconstruct a sequence of events with an identified actor at its center, tracing movements, communications, and associations that may eventually lead to a location. The online environment surrounding this case has become its own distinct problem. Commentary, speculation, and theory crafting around a case of this public profile is not new. It has been a feature of high-profile missing persons investigations for years. What has intensified in recent cycles is the degree to which that commentary has moved from passive spectating into active targeting of individuals connected to the case. Family members have been accused, by online commentators with no access to the evidence, of various forms of direct involvement in the disappearance. A daughter who is a public figure returned to her professional life after an extended absence and found that her reappearance was covered in terms of ratings impact, rather than personal resilience or grief. The reduction of a family's crisis to a metric is not a new journalistic failure, but it is a particularly visible one in this case, and its effect on the family, who are already navigating maximum uncertainty, is one that mental health professionals who work with crisis-affected families describe as a compounding injury. The psychological dimension of this investigation cannot be separated from its operational one. Detectives, investigators, and search coordinators are not immune to the cumulative effects of working a case that generates constant public attention, repeated false leads, institutional turmoil, and no confirmed resolution. Behavioral analysts who study crisis response in law enforcement contexts describe what happens to investigative morale when the lead-to-result cycle fails repeatedly. An initial surge of engagement following a new tip gradually gives way to a more muted response as investigators internalize the pattern of disappointment. This does not mean they stop working. It means they begin to approach new information with a defensive caution that can sometimes slow the urgency of follow-through. The lead that appears overnight and turns into nothing by morning, a detained person who has no actual connection to the case, a tip that dissolves under scrutiny, is not just a waste of resources in the moment. It is a withdrawal from an account of institutional energy that does not refill automatically. The family's position within this dynamic is the most difficult of all. They are not investigators. They cannot distance themselves professionally from the question of what happened to their loved one. Every report of a new lead is not a data point in an investigative sequence. It is a moment of hope, held against the accumulating weight of all the previous moments that came to nothing. Every official response of a single-word denial is not a bureaucratic communication. It is an experience of being dismissed by the very system that is supposed to be working on their behalf. Psychologists who treat grief in contexts of unresolved disappearance describe this state as a particular kind of suspended suffering. The person is neither able to mourn a confirmed loss nor able to hope with any stability, because the information environment keeps alternating between signals that demand each response. The family is trapped in that alternation, and it will not end until the investigation produces something definitive. What genetic genealogy has demonstrated, in the cases where it has worked, is that definitiveness is possible from what initially appeared to be insufficient evidence. 9 hairs on the bodies of murder victims, 1 DNA trace on a knife sheath, invisible without magnification. These are the evidence items that anchored prosecutions that once seemed unanchored. The hair in the bedroom of the missing woman is a similar item, small enough to seem inadequate, significant enough to potentially carry everything. The specialists now working with it have proven they can do what the broader scientific community once said could not be done. The uncertainty is not about their capability. It is about what the sample can still yield, how much of it remains, and whether the biological reality of what is there matches the investigative necessity of what is needed. If it does, the case changes fundamentally. If it does not, investigators will have to find another path, and the family will have to keep waiting in a limbo that no loved one should have to occupy for this long. The reward tied to information in this case, now exceeding $1 million, reflects how seriously outside stakeholders are treating the possibility that the public holds a piece of information that formal investigators have not yet accessed. Tip lines exist because witnesses exist in almost every case. People who saw something or heard something and have not yet connected what they observed to the investigation they are watching unfold. The genetic evidence, if it produces a name, may eventually align with a human memory somewhere. Someone who saw that person near the missing woman's home. Someone who heard something that made no sense at the time. Someone who knows something they have not yet put together into the shape of a tip. That alignment between forensic identity and human memory is how many of these cases finally close. The forensic genealogists who have lived through that moment describe it as the point where the wall becomes a door. Whether this case reaches that point and when is what everyone watching is now waiting to find out.